Hello, today we are going to be talking about the little organisms that are alive. So let's get started. So today we are going to be talking about viruses, bacteria, protists, and fungi. So our essential question is still the same. How do scientists define and organize living things? So we've talked about animals, we've talked about plants, we've talked about the classification system, and today we're talking about, like I said, the little tiny organisms. So I'm going to minimize myself. This is a longer lesson, so halfway through, if you want to take a break, I'll let you know about where that is, and then you can pause the video, go take a break, and then come back, watch the rest. Okay, here's our science standards. This is what you are graded on. This is what goes into or onto your report cards. Those you should be familiar with. And here are the objectives for today. The objectives are the questions at the end of the video as well. And usually you can find the answers to the questions by looking at the title of the slide. That's how I put these two as well in order. So your questions also go in order when you look back at the slides. So you'll be able to explain what a protist is and list at least 4 characteristics of a protist, explain 3 ways that they are beneficial and 4 ways that they are harmful. You'll be able to list 3 types of protists and 2 characteristics for each of those types. You'll be able to explain what fungi are and list 6 characteristics of fungi. Talk about the 5 parts of a mushroom fungus, explain how fungi reproduce. You will be able to list and explain the 4 different types of fungi and 3 ways that fungi are beneficial, and give examples of how they are beneficial, and then 2 ways that they are harmful, and give some examples of different fungi and how they are harmful. You will be able to explain what bacteria are and list at least 6 characteristics of bacteria. Be able to list the 3 shapes of bacteria, list and explain the 3 ways bacteria are beneficial. Be able to give examples of different bacteria for that, and 3 ways that bacteria is harmful, and give different bacterial examples of the diseases that they cause. Be able to list 7 parts of the bacterium cell and explain their purpose. Explain 3 ways that bacteria get their food, 3 ways bacteria survive, and 2 ways bacteria reproduce. Be able to explain what archaea are and list at least 5 characteristics of archaea. Explain what viruses are and list at least 7 characteristics of virus. Explain the 4 shapes of viruses and list at least 1 viral sickness for each shape. Explain the 5 steps in how viruses reproduce. So let's keep going from there. Our substandard is conduct an investigation to provide evidence that living things are made of cells, either one cell or many different cells and types of cells. So where will we be in our classification system today? Remember, it's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Today we will be in both domains and kingdom. So domain, eukarya, archaea, and bacteria, all 3. And we will be in not only those 3, but the kingdoms of Protista and fungi. So that's where we'll be in our classification of living things. So we start with protists. What are protists? These are different pictures of protists that you might see under a microscope. Protists belong to the domain eukarya. That's where animals and plants belong as well. They are simpler, however, than animals and plants or fungi, which we'll learn about next, but they are also in the domain eukarya. So 4 different things are in eukarya. What are the characteristics of protists? So one of your questions at the end, can you list the characteristics? So most protists are microscopic, but some are visible with your eye. Some you can see, but they're very tiny. All protists live in moist environments where it's humid and hot. Protists live where people live and interact. Most protists are harmless, and some are actually beneficial, and there are others that can cause disease. Harmful protists are called parasites. So there's a picture of some harmful protists. I don't really think they have eyes, but there are some examples. We'll talk about those in a minute. So beneficial protists, well, how do they help us? Well, they can provide food, which is rich in vitamins and minerals for humans and other living things like fish. So red algae and kelp are actually very beneficial to us. There's some pictures of it. They also provide symbiotic beneficial relationships with other organisms. What do I mean by this? Well, protists will actually live inside of termites. That shows you how small they must be, right? And those termites, the protists and the termites help them to digest wood, which is what they eat. Lichens help fungi and green algae as well. So they have relationships that help each other. And finally, protists are beneficial because they provide bioluminescence, which is glowing in the dark, which is helpful in the deep, deep ocean where there's not much light. Okay, what about harmful protists? How do they hurt us? Well, we have protists that live inside of humans and other organisms, and they actually steal their nutrients. They live inside of them and eat off of them. They eat the good stuff out. When the person or the animal eats something, they take the first best stuff. They're called parasites. So here's an example of a parasite in the bottom right here. Giardia is a protist found in certain drinking water. This protist will cause fever, diarrhea, and stomach pain. The protist actually attaches itself to your small intestine, and then it takes your nutrients away, and then you don't get them. And the disease is called giardias. Some other harmful protists. They carry disease in mosquitoes. So the protist plasmodium travels with the mosquito. When a mosquito with plasmodium bites a human, the protist infects the red blood cells of the human, which causes malaria. Not so much in this country, but several other countries like Haiti, one of them. Another harmful effect of the protists will be that they cause a thing called sleeping sickness. That's what that looks like. And I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly. The Trypanosoma protozoa causes sleeping sickness. This causes fever, chills, pain in your limbs, and anemia. And eventually it affects the central nervous system and it causes extreme lethargy and even can cause death. So there's nothing to mess around with. Another type of harmful protist is the ones that cause plant diseases. So there's a disease on a potato there. The Irish potato famine in 1845 was caused by the organism Phytophthora infestanis. Hope I said that right. The infestation ruined up to 1/2 of the potato crop the year and about 3/4 of the crop over the next 7 years. And because at that time farmers relied heavily on the potato as a source of food, the infestation resulted in the death of 1 million Irish because they starved without those potatoes. So protists can cause plant diseases. So what are the 3 types of protists? Number 1, they are the animal-like protists. They are heterotrophs. What does that mean? They cannot make their own food. They have to eat something else, right? They are unicellular. They only have one cell. They're free swimming. They can move around, and they reproduce either asexually or sexually. So there is an amoeba. That is an animal-like protist. Amoebas will surround and trap the food particles. So they have to eat, right, by trapping their food. They cannot make their own food. They're heterotrophs. The Giardia, which we talked about being one of the parasites in water, right? They are also an animal-like protist. And they do have little, looks like eyes, don't they? They cause intestinal illness in humans, which we talked about. The second type of protist is the plant-like protist. They are autotrophs, which means they make their own food, but some could be heterotrophs. They are unicellular or they could be multicellular. Again, they are free swimming, but they could also be attached where they don't move. And they are both sexual and asexual reproduction. So red algae is an example of a plant-like protist. Red algae is a seaweed that is very good for you. It's called nori. I don't know how it tastes, but it's good for you. And dinoflagellates. They glow in the dark. There's your luminescence, right? Those are plant-like protists. Then the third type of protist is the fungi-like protist. They are heterotrophs. That means they have to eat something else. They can't make their own food. They're unicellular, but they often live in colonies. You can't really tell they're unicellular because they're all together. They move during some part of the life cycle and they reproduce asexually. Here is an example, a slime mold. Slime molds grow in garden beds. And then the water mold. Water molds attack plants and crops. So what are fungi? This is our next category. So that was protists. This is fungi. Fungi is plural for fungus. Fungi are any of a group of spore-producing organisms feeding on organic matter. Spore producing is the key. So there's your famous mushroom. That is a fungus, a fungi. Fungi belong to the domain Eukarya, just like the protists, the plants, and the animals. Fungi are eukaryotic cells with cell walls. And they are heterotrophs, and they feed by absorbing their food through their cell walls. The cells of fungi are arranged into hyphaea. These are thread-like tubes which allow them to spread over large areas. Hyphaea give fungi structure and grow into food sources. They release chemicals that break down the food, and the hyphaea absorb that food. Fungi are present everywhere in our environment. Some fungi act as decomposers. Decomposers are things that eat dead organisms. They help to decompose something when it dies. Some fungi are parasites that attack living hosts. The biggest living thing on Earth is actually a fungus. It's called the honey fungus colony. It grows in a forest in Oregon. It is 1,000 football fields long. Most of the honey fungus is growing unseen under the ground, however. Here's an example of the honey fungus. You can see the aerial picture there, how large of an area it covers. And then there's the up-close picture over here. What are the parts of a mushroom fungus? So here's a picture. You have the cap, the gills, the spores, that's the reproduction part, and the stalk. And then here at the bottom are the hyphaea. Notice how they're like little roots that spread out all over the place. How do fungi reproduce? Fungi send up fruiting bodies, which you would call mushrooms. So here they are. There's your fruiting body, your mushroom. And then they produce spores that are carried by the wind and by water to new locations. These spores then start a new fungal colony. There's the spore. The fungi can also reproduce sexually. So if the hyphaea from two colonies grow close together, they will trade genetic information. There's the spores that grow hyphaea or to get together. And then you have another genetic information shared. And then new fruiting bodies will develop, and then you go back to the beginning where you have the fruiting body again, and then more spores, more hyphaea, new fruiting bodies, etc., in a big circle. So that's how they reproduce. What are the different types of fungi? Number one, they are the disease-causing pathogens. And I don't know if I'll say this correctly, Chytridiomycota. So they live in fresh water, marine habitats, and in soil. Chytridiomycota fungi can be found in other fungi. They can be found in algae, plants, and amphibians. The second type of fungi is a zygomycota. Those are the bread molds. These can cause allergic reactions and respiratory illness if you eat the mold. Do not eat bread molds. Types of bread molds include these ones here: Aspergillus, Penicillium, Fusarium, Mucor, and Rhizopus. The third type of fungus is the Ascomycota. This is known as yeast. And some you can eat, like those that are in bread, and some are used in antibiotics that help people get well. And the fourth type of fungus or fungi is the Basidiomycota. These are the mushrooms. There are many types of mushrooms. Some you can eat, but others are poisonous. So those are the types of fungi. How are fungi helpful? Well, they can provide nutrients to organisms. Like I said, there's some that you can eat mushroom-wise. The shiitake mushroom fungus provides nutritious food for humans. It breaks down dead wood and makes nutrients available for living things. The yeast fungus helps us when we bake our breads and in some beverages that can be made with yeast. How else are they helpful? Fungi work with plants to increase absorption. They help the plants to grow. Mycorrhiza fungi provides improved nutrient uptakes for plants by kind of loosening up the soil to make it more efficient for the plant's roots to get into the ground and absorb more nutrients. They grow around plant seeds and roots, and they bring water to the plant and help the plant grow. They also eat plant sugars. There's an example of mycorrhiza. How else are fungi helpful? They provide antibiotics and antiviral medications for humans. The penicillium mold provides chemicals that we use in antibiotics. Maybe you've heard of penicillin. It is used in the production of a number of biotechnology-produced enzymes and macromolecules to mass produce a hybrid organism. And it eats plant sugars. There is the penicillium mold. How else is fungi helpful? It forms partnerships with autotrophic algae, lichens, and bacteria. A fungus-lichen-algae partnership provides water, shelter, and minerals for the lichen, while its partner, the algae, provides food. Chemicals used in dyes, perfumes, and deodorants are also used with fungi, and foods for animals in harsh environments. Here's a lichen and here's a fungus, and I don't know if I can say this one, Sclerotoia veratri. That was a bad pronunciation. How is fungi harmful? Fungi can make people sick. Yeast can cause diaper rash, and it can cause yeast infections. There's an example of different skin yeast infections. Kind of gross. Dermatophyte causes athlete's foot, which is a skin infection. Ringworm, which is a skin infection. There's an example of ringworm on the right. Can cause Candida auris, or also known as Candida, which could cause death. And there are no medicines to prevent fungal infections, only things to help it. So you want to be eating well so you don't get these in the first place. Don't eat these fungi. There's an example of the Candida auris fungi. Most of the funguses look like they have tiny branches all over the place. That's what they all look like. Okay, harmful fungus. Fungi can destroy food and property. The saprobic fungi decay wood by breaking it down, which causes it to rot. So you don't want to see this kind of fungi in your trees. Penicillium, it can spoil food. It also can be helpful with the antibiotics, but it can also spoil food. It can produce poisons or cause allergic reactions. Some people are actually allergic to certain antibiotics like penicillin. So you have to be careful. There's a bunch of fungus growing on an orange. And yeast can destroy stored food because it eats it, right? Okay, now is a good stopping point if you want to take a pause and come back, and we'll be back on bacteria. Okay, if you paused it, welcome back. We are now talking about bacteria. So there's some bacteria floating around there on the screen. Trying to get it to pick. Here we go. What are bacteria? So bacteria have their own domain called bacteria. We are no longer in the eukarya domain. We are now in a domain all by itself called bacteria. Bacteria are also called germs. They are microscopic organisms that are not visible to the naked eye. You have to use a microscope to see them. They are so small, millions will fit in a period at the end of a sentence. Millions. That's how small they are. Bacteria are less complex than protists and fungi. because they do not have a nucleus. So that's why they have their own category. Bacteria make up most of the organisms on Earth, believe it or not. Bacteria are found everywhere. They're found in the soil, they're found in our water, and they're found in the air, and even inside of you. Bacteria can be autotrophs, they make their own food. They can be heterotrophs, they have to eat their food, or they can be decomposers that absorb the nutrients from decaying organisms. How are bacteria classified? Remember, they got their own domain. Well, they're classified by the shape of their cell. So the first type is the coccus. Those are the ball-shaped bacteria. They look like little round balls. Here's the bigger picture, and here's the little actual picture there. Then there is the bacillus. Those are rod-shaped bacteria. And then there's finally the spirilla. Those are spiral-shaped bacteria. So you have circles, rods, and spirals. How are bacteria helpful? Well, they're good for health and medicine. They help digest food in your intestines, and they help prevent harmful bacteria from making you sick. You want to have good bacteria in your intestines. That's important to fight off illness. Some make vitamins. 2, they are helpful for oxygen production. Autotrophic bacteria, the kind that make their own food, will release oxygen into the air to help you breathe better, a lot like what plants do. They are also good for food production. Bacteria are needed to turn milk into buttermilk, into yogurt, to sour cream, and to make cheese. Number 4, they help with the environmental recycling. Bacteria in soil, like I had said, bacteria can act as decomposers. They break down dead organisms, which returns chemicals to the environment so that other organisms can reuse those chemicals. So a good example of this is nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They sit on the roots of certain plants. They change nitrogen gas from the air into a form that the plants can use and helps them to grow. And then finally, bacteria can be environmental cleanup. Some bacteria turn poisonous chemicals from oil spills and gas leaks into harmless substances. Okay, how are bacteria harmful? Harmful bacteria are called pathogens because they cause disease and illness. But luckily, fewer than 1% are harmful. So there's more good bacteria than bad bacteria. However, the bad bacteria can be very bad. So one, they can cause disease and illness in humans. So E. coli is I can't even say the full name, Escherichia coli, which is E. coli abbreviated. You probably heard of that. These are bacteria that live in your intestines. They come from contaminated water or food such as raw vegetables and undercooked hamburger. Symptoms would be diarrhea, stomach cramping, and vomiting. Then you've probably heard of strep throat. That comes from the streptococcus bacteria. They get into your throat and make it feel sore. If untreated, strep throat can cause kidney inflammation or rheumatic fever, which could lead to damage of your heart. Symptoms of streptococcus are a sore throat, swollen tonsils, red spots at the back of your throat, like the picture there, fever, or headache. More harmful bacteria, Staphylococcus, also known as a staph infection. These are very dangerous. These are bacterial germs commonly found on the skin or in your nose. Sometimes the bacteria can invade deeper into your body, like in your bloodstream, your joints, your bones, your lungs, or your heart. Staph infections can cause skin conditions like boils or impetigo, food poisoning, bloodstream infections that can damage your organs, bones, and muscles, toxic shock syndrome, which can be life-threatening, or septic arthritis, which causes painful joints and bones. Treatment is usually antibiotics, but antibiotics no longer work on some types of staph infections. Be very careful with this. Then there is Mycobacterium, this causes tuberculosis. These bacteria attack the lungs, kidney, spine, or brain. However, not everyone infected with tuberculosis becomes sick. There are many more human illnesses caused by bacteria, but again, I want to remind you that only 1% of the bacteria in our environment is harmful. 2, bacteria can spoil foods. Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus, these are bacteria that cause food spoilage. And 3rd, bacteria can cause disease to plants. The Pseudomonas solacerium, these bacteria cause wilt in tomato plants and brown rot on potatoes. The Xanthomus citri, these are bacteria that cause citrus cankers. You can see them on the right there. And the Erwinia amblivora, these bacteria cause fire blight of apples and pears. And that's what it looks like there on the right. What does a bacteria cell look like? All bacteria are single-celled prokaryotes. That is a separate living organism that can perform all of the functions necessary for life, and it's one cell. There's an example of a bacteria cell, and there's all the parts. We'll talk about them. The cell wall protects from foreign invaders and keeps the cell from drying out. There's the cell wall. The cell membrane is located inside the cell wall, and it controls what substances pass into and out of the cell. There's the cell membrane. The cytoplasm is everything inside of the cell membrane. It's represented in green in this picture. It's not necessarily green, though. There's the cytoplasm. The DNA is the genetic material that are string-like and provide the chemical instructions for the cell. There's the DNA, that string-like stuff in the center. Flagellum, they help the bacteria move. That's like the little tail that you see on the bacteria there. Ribosomes are proteins. That's where proteins are made, I should say. Those are those little tiny blue spots inside the cytoplasm. And finally, the pill. These are tiny hairs that help the cell move and reproduce. Those are the parts of the bacteria cell. How do bacteria get their food? Well, we said some bacteria can make their own food. They are autotrophs. They use it from sunlight, just like plants do. Some bacteria create food from chemicals, especially chemicals from underwater volcanoes. And 3, some bacteria take in food through their cell walls. Food could include milk, sugar, meat, or dead cells. Some bacteria use the energy from food to make poisonous chemicals called toxins that cause sickness. There is a bacteria in that picture on the right that eats skin. Kind of gross. How do bacteria survive? Bacteria cannot move fast, so they cannot escape intense heat. They cannot hunt for their food, or they cannot escape predators that like to eat them. However, they can survive by sheltering in place in harsh conditions, and they form a thick-walled shell around their DNA to protect it and around their cytoplasm. It's called an endospore. And the endospore can grow back into a full cell when the conditions improve. So they have a way of sheltering in place. They also reproduce very quickly. Even if predators can eat some of the bacteria, they always make more. They actually double every time. So they make 1, and the 1 splits into 2, and the 2 splits into 4, and the 4 splits into, what would that be? 16, and the 16 splits into 32 very, very quickly. How do they reproduce? Well, I just gave you a hint. They use binary fusion. That's one method. This is an asexual reproduction in which the bacteria grow and they divide into 2 identical cells. The population will double with every split. There's an example on the right of one cell growing longer and longer until it finally splits in 2. The second way they reproduce is called conjugation. That a bacteria passes its genetic material to a neighboring bacteria when 2 bacteria cells come together. Note that this does not produce more bacteria, but it allows the genetic information to spread and to change. Bacteria that is resistant to an antibiotic could pass this resistance information to another bacteria by conjugation. That is how you get more and more resistant bacteria to antibiotics. Soon the whole bacteria population becomes resistant. So here's an example on the right of bacteria trading genetic information. How do bacteria reproduce? Again, let's look at comparison between binary fission and conjugation. In binary fission, the offspring are identical. They take one bacteria, takes little time, and it's through asexual reproduction. Conjugation, the offspring have variation. It takes two bacteria, takes more time than binary fission. It's through sexual reproduction, and it passes an F factor, which you don't need to really know about. How are they the same? They produce offspring. They involve the DNA. Okay, now we are on to archaea, which has got its own domain as well. Archaea have their own domain, which is the newest domain that has been discovered since, I think, 1977. Archaea are unicellular, one-celled microorganisms that, like bacteria, do not have a nucleus. Archaea have different chemical processes than bacteria. That's why they get their own domain. Many archaea live in extreme conditions, such as very hot springs, salty water, or deep under the ground. Many archaea are anaerobic. That means that they can survive with very low oxygen. These are the type of organisms that could live inside of root canals, and your dentist may never know it. Anaerobic archaea in your mouth can make you sick. The differences between bacteria and archaea are complicated, so you are going to learn more about them when you get into your high school biology class. Just know that they are different because they have different processes. What are viruses? Next part now. Viruses are not alive. Very important. Everything we've talked about so far is alive. A virus is not alive. A virus is a tiny, non-living particle that enters and then reproduces inside a living cell. Viruses may look like cells, but they are not cells. They are not part of the living things classification system because, again, they are not alive. Viruses cannot reproduce on their own. To make more, they enter a living cell and cause that cell to make more viruses. They don't make the viruses themselves. They make the cell do it. Viruses do not eat. They do not produce waste. They do not respond to their surroundings. Again, viruses are not alive. What size are viruses? Well, viruses are very, very small and are measured in nanometers. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. The common cold virus is 75 nanometers in diameter. A red blood cell, in comparison, is 7,500 nanometers. And at the bottom there, you'll see some other things and how many nanometers they are. And you can see where the virus falls in relation to some of those other things. So the masks that we wear for the coronavirus are really not doing anything because the coronavirus is so very small, it can get right through the little fibers of the mask. What are the shapes of viruses? Well, there's the enveloped virus. This is spherical and surrounded by a membrane. It looks like this. That's what the coronavirus looks like. Here's examples of enveloped viruses: the flu, the measles, herpes, and corona. Helical is the next shape of a virus. They are hollow-filled tubes with amino acids. They look like this. They're hollow-filled tubes. Examples of helical viruses: the tobacco mosaic virus that affects the tobacco plants, and the rabies and other animal viruses are helical. The third shape of a virus is the icosahedral. They're made of triangles fused together in a sphere, like that. Examples of icosahedral viruses are the rhinovirus, that's called the common cold, hepatitis, and foot and mouth disease. And then there's the bacteriophage. That is an icosahedral with a tail, and it infects bacteria only. Here's what it looks like. Kind of looks like a little robot or a bug. Examples of phages, viruses that affect bacteria, the bacteriophages can cause human disease, cholera, and diphtheria. Again, they need a bacteria in order to become something that makes you sick. Okay, how do viruses reproduce? A virus needs a host cell in order to reproduce. Remember, viruses are not alive. A host is an organism that provides a source of energy or a suitable environment for a virus to live or grow. Step 1, viruses attach itself to the host cell using tail fibers to stick to the host cell's membrane. 2, the virus injects a genetic material, its own DNA, into the cells. Here it is, injecting the DNA. 3, the host cell reads the DNA and then is instructed to make copies of the virus parts. The cell kind of becomes a zombie and just starts making more and more viruses. Step 4, the virus parts are assembled. And finally, step 5, the host cell bursts open and many new viruses are released, destroying the cell in the process. I have a video you'll watch later to see how this works. Okay, again, let's take a look at where we are. We talked about 2 items in the kingdom of Protista and fungi, which is in the eukarya domain, and we talked about things in archaea, and we talked about bacteria in their domain. Notice how virus is down in the corner. They are not alive, so they are not classified in living organisms. They are not in the classification system. That's why I left them over there on the bottom right corner. Okay, here are your homework questions. Explain what protists are and list at least 4 characteristics of protists. That will be on your slide. List 3 ways protists are beneficial, 4 ways that they are harmful. What are the 3 types of protists and 2 characteristics of each type? Remember, they were animal-like protists, plant-like protists, and fungi-like protists. Explain what fungi are and list at least 6 characteristics of fungi. List 5 parts of a mushroom fungus. Explain how fungi reproduce. Remember, they use spores. List and explain the 4 different types of fungi. List and explain 3 ways fungi are beneficial, giving examples of different fungi and how they are beneficial. List and explain 2 ways fungi are harmful, giving examples of different fungi and how they are harmful. Explain what bacteria are and list at least 6 characteristics of bacteria, such as unicellular, etc. List the 3 shapes of bacteria. Remember what those were? Coccus, spirulia, and rod-like, right? Rod-shaped. List and explain 5 ways bacteria are beneficial, giving examples of different bacteria and how they are beneficial. List and explain 3 ways bacteria are harmful, giving examples of different bacteria and the diseases they cause. List 7 parts of a bacterium cell and explain their purpose. That was that diagram. List 3 ways bacteria get their food. Explain 3 ways bacteria survive. Explain and define the 2 ways bacteria reproduce. Explain what archaea are and list at least 5 characteristics of archaea. Explain what viruses are and list at least 7 characteristics of viruses. Explain the 4 shapes of viruses and list at least 1 viral sickness for each shape. And finally, explain the 5 steps in how viruses reproduce. I will come back on, so hopefully you will do well on this. You just have to go back through the slides and all the answers are on the slides. Have a good day. Bye.